our next question. So, what was your experience like traveling to different parts of the world and experiencing Black culture? So, for example, traveling to West Africa versus Black culture as we know it in North America.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. First of all, there isn't one Black culture as we know it in North America. There are 100,000 variations of Black culture in Canada and, say, in the States and Mexico, just as there are 100,000 variations of white culture. And it's funny because if somebody asks a person to define, well, what is white culture, in Canada, most people kind of give their head a shake and say, well, what does that mean? Like, the question is so broad that it's almost meaningless. And of course, Black culture is just as broad and variegated. Are you from West Africa, South Africa, East Africa? Are you a person who's been living here for 10 generations, or did your parents come yesterday, or did you arrive yesterday? What is your economic class? What's your religion? What's your skin tone? Where do you come from? What languages do you speak? There are just so many variations in Black culture that there is not one Black culture. There are just as many Black cultures as there are white cultures, of course. And so it's a really interesting issue. And I think it's important for Canadians, especially those who aren't Black, to recognize that it's not some homogenous thing. It's just as varied as anybody else's, kind of cultural experiences. Learning other languages, in my case, French and Spanish, and going to live in other countries has been one of the richest parts of my life, especially as a volunteer. Not so much like going to stay as a tourist somewhere in a fancy hotel for a weekend, but going away to live, in my case, like in Spain and in France and in Mali, Cameroon, and Niger, and in West Africa, and also to go to Swaziland. These experiences changed my life and opened them up. And I think that for many people, traveling to a place where you're not comfortable, going to a place where you didn't come from, where you don't belong, where you don't know anybody, these experiences can be very alienating, but they also tend to send you back home far more cognizant of how you want to live and who you are and the person that you are. Somehow, paradoxically, going away helps you understand better where you came from and who you are. And so it makes you much more focused and driven in terms of how you want to move your own life forward. And so going to live in as a volunteer with Crossroads International in Mali and Cameroon and Niger and Swaziland really changed my life, opened up my vista of literature, introduced me to more Black literature, but also to the possibilities of my own writing. And they changed my life forever. And so I often tell young children and high school and university students that if they have the chance to travel, they should take it. And I don't mean just the 5-star hotel travel for a week somewhere, but I mean going to live somewhere and work or study or get engaged in a volunteer activity, be part of a community. It's a life-changing thing. And it certainly changed and opened up my life profoundly and enhanced and sort of rooted my own sense of Blackness. It really helped me feel more confident and quiet and just calmly self-affirmative, as a Black man. And Malcolm X talked about the same thing. When he traveled around the world, his view of himself as a Black man changed profoundly shortly before his very unfortunate assassination. So it's a fantastic thing to do if you have a chance to go somewhere where you don't belong and get involved in some other country.
That immersion into culture is just such a different experience than just traveling and being a tourist in some ways, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's night and day. It's such a beautiful thing if you can do it, if you can create the time for it.
Yeah.
Why do you think representation is important in storytelling, especially in children's books like Beatrice and the Croc Herring?
Why is representation important in literature, especially in children's books like Beatrice and Croc Herring? Well, I'm sure there were a few, but I read pretty widely as a child, and I found pretty well no Black characters, or pretty well no characters who weren't white in the books that I was given by librarians and school teachers, to read. I found not ridiculous and horrid racial stereotypes, like just absolutely vile books like Little Black Sambo. But if you exclude kind of vile racist caricatures of Black people in books like that, I didn't really find any children's literature. And again, I'm speaking from my generation. I was born in 1957. So I'm talking about being a young reader in the early 1960s, I didn't find it. But I was moving into my own sense of Blackness and pride, dealing with my hair, growing out an afro for the first time. And I wanted to find literature that sort of spoke to me and to the identity I was moving into. And so I just threw myself into the adult literature that was populating my parents' bookshelves and just inhaled, James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston and Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison, on and on and on. I just ate them up when I was 14, 15, and I just devoured all that I could find on my parents' shelves. And it's the immediacy of that Black fiction, the power of it, the way it made me feel that I belonged in the world, and I could see myself in the world and sort of chart my way through the world better. It was so vital to my sense of well-being, to my own development as a young teenager. And so I don't think that any writer should write anything that they don't want to write or that they can't write. But collectively, we as children need to be able to find a diversity of literatures that represent the diversity of our experiences so that we can all reach and mess around and find things that speak to us and that excite us, and that we see ourselves, we can recognize ourselves in these works. And so it's vitally important to have a literature that represents people from all around the world and all around this country, just as it's vitally important to be hiring people from those backgrounds and giving them opportunities for work and for study and for social advancement. And so if you deprive children of a diversity of literatures, you're basically telling them that they don't belong if they don't fit into the mainstream. So it's really important to have a diversity of voices and literatures available to all people, including children. And I'm really proud to have featured this strong, clever, argumentative, tough-minded young Black girl named Beatrice in this book, and to make her the protagonist, not somebody else's window dressing, not just to prop up another character, but to give her agency as a lead character in a book. I love that. And I would have loved a book like that, I think, when I was a child. So I'm happy to give it to some children now.
As someone who isn't Black, it was, for me, coming to Black literature was a lot later as well. And I think hearing the story told from a different perspective, a truer perspective, was very eye-opening. So as we speak about, the importance of representation for children or even adults from different groups, being able to see themselves in the characters, I also think there's a lot of value in those that are different from the people who are actually writing, to be able to truly see what reality is and what the truth is, and hear the narratives from the perspectives and the voices of those true characters, as opposed to, say, a white writer writing about a Black character.
Like Harper Lee writing To Kill a Mockingbird.
Exactly. Yeah, the classic sort of example. Like when I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, which I admit I read that maybe 5 years ago, very recently. Yeah, very eye-opening to think about reading a book like that versus something like To Kill a Mockingbird, and the way in which Black characters are portrayed, and the vibrancy and the strength and resilience and intelligence that is so differently portrayed.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of admiration for Harper Lee and her writing, and also for parts of, say, a person like Ernest Hemingway. But let's be real, you never see a dimensional Black character in a book by Harper Lee or Ernest Hemingway. They are cardboard cutout characters.
Very stereotypical.
And they have no agency or depth or dimensionality. They're just there. Even though To Kill a Mockingbird is about racial discrimination and racial injustice, the Black characters in the book are completely two-dimensional and don't have any real depth or agency. They're not developed characters. And so I don't think that's an accident, and I think it's very unfortunate. And so that's not to take away from Harper Lee or Hemingway, but you need to dive often, into Black literature if you're really going to understand those voices and those characters. And so there's a lot to be said for giving children a chance to read literature by Black writers, for example, in schools, or by Indigenous writers in schools. It's vitally important.
Yeah, just if we want to create a society that actually understands each other and can relate in a way that is better than where we're at now, it feels like you need to be able to hear that voice differently and to hear that perspective differently. Otherwise, if I'm always hearing about what Black people are like from a white author, that's never going to help change my perspective.
No, you're right. And so I think it's a healthy thing to be moving in the direction of really encouraging children to get their hands on literature that addresses Black issues and Black people written by Black writers. As an example, same thing would apply to other groups, Indigenous people or Chinese Canadians or Japanese Canadians, others. It's very important to expand, the reach of the authors that we offer to children.
Yeah, so we have one more question from the audience. This question is from Mark, and he would like to know if there are any particular authors whose work has shaped yours, whether it be in terms of style, content, etc.
Have any authors shaped me in terms of style or content? Well, absolutely. I mean, the people I read are, of course, my greatest teachers, whether they're alive or dead. Writers have to read. And if you're not reading, chances are you won't write very well. You really have to be reading a lot in order to develop your skills as a writer. I could go in so many directions, but I just say that we all remember the books that we read when we were 15 or 16 or 14 if we love them. If you read a book that you love at 30, there's a good chance you'll have forgotten the plot by the time you're 45. But at least in my experience. But if you read a book that you love when you're 15 or 14, 16, you're going to remember that book when you're 75 years old because it sticks with you somehow if you absorb it as a teenager. So I'll talk to you about the books that I dove into as a teenager and how they marked me. And I guess the one example among 100 I could give is the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was written by Alex Haley, even though it's called an autobiography. It was written by Haley. It's an incredibly powerful and disturbing book. It was written, of course, shortly before Malcolm X was assassinated, and he had a rough life. Not to mention it ended in a bloodbath with his murder, but he had a rough life, and for a while, when he became a really prominent Black Muslim with the Nation of Islam, he argued that white people were the devil incarnate. And he argues this in his book. And here I am, 14 years old, reading this book and struggling with it. Because my mother was white and she was no devil. And I knew that this could not be true, to just carte blanche describe all white people as literal devils. I knew this was ridiculous. But the arguments were very powerful. And so as a 14-year-old, I had to really struggle with this. What's he saying? How does this make sense? It seems so powerful, but it's wrong. Thankfully, Malcolm X does go travel in the Middle East. He meets many Muslims of many different racial origins and concludes that there is a possibility of people of different racial backgrounds to work together to oppose racial injustice. And of course, I think that's one of the reasons why he was assassinated, unfortunately. But I did see the transition in the book, which was very relieving to me as a 14, 15-year-old, to see that he grew out of his hatred and into a more loving stance. So the book, it had so much volcanic kind of emotional development that I'd say that the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I read when I was 14 and 15, was one of the books that's influenced me the most. And the immediacy of the prose. Books like that, they take you by the throat and they pull you in from the first sentence. And that's how I want to write.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Veronica has a question. Two of your memorable protagonists, Aminata and Beatrice, are women. Is there a particular reason that you, a male author, made them female?
Well, they were the characters who came to me. They were the ones that offered themselves up. I've written a lot of male protagonists too. Mahatma Grafton in a novel called Some Great Thing, and Langston Kane in Your Own Blood. And, I've had a lot of strong, and I hope interesting male figures. Keita Ali in The Illegal is a male protagonist as well. But women have always kind of jumped up and wanted to occupy vital roles in my writing. They've always wanted to sort of take center stage. Sometimes I have to actually hold them back a bit to let some other characters move forward. And I think it's because I heard so many really vibrant Black women in my life talking. And of course, as a boy, one of my greatest pleasures was listening to my older cousins, Black women or aunts or, grandmother talking when they thought no boy or man was listening. And I used to just love to overhear those conversations and listen to what those women were saying. And of course, I love the sound of women talking and thinking. And so it's really infected in a happy way in my own writing. And I feel that when I step out of my own skin and try to write about a woman, I sometimes feel I'm more successful than when I'm writing about a man. There's something liberating about writing about a character that I could never be. I feel freer because I'm not identifying myself. And so I just feel less vulnerable. So I can kind of go for it and just create that character the way I want them to be seen. And they seem more colorful, more vibrant sometimes than my male characters. And so I think in some ways, it's been easier for me to write women than men.
Thank you for that answer. So we're getting a couple more questions. So I'll just ask the next one. So this is from Jahan, and he wants to know, what sort of adversity have you faced in the predominant white culture of art and literature? So he'd just like you to share your reflections on that.
What adversity have I faced in the world of art and literature? Well, first of all, I have been extremely fortunate and privileged and thankfully successful. There aren't that many writers who get to live, off their pen. And although I teach now, at the University of Guelph, I've lived most of my life as a self-employed writer, and I'm very grateful for that. But it's hard, and many writers of color, Indigenous, Black writers, other writers of color, have a very hard time with it. And I think I want to answer that question by talking about structural inequities and systemic inequities. A writer doesn't exist in a vacuum. You don't become a novelist all by yourself. Of course, you have parents and teachers and editors and people. But who are the most influential people in the world of, say, Canadian literature, apart from the writers themselves? Editors, marketers, publishers, literary agents, literary critics, book festival organizers. These would be some of the people, scholars of, say, let's talk about Black literature for a minute. These would be some of the most influential people who can kind of make or break your career, who can make or break possibilities for you. And even to this day, in 2022, there are astonishingly few Black people in positions of power or influence in the world of Canadian publishing. I've been publishing books since 1992, so 30 years, and I've been writing, writing and publishing for another 10 years before that, but they were books yet, short stories. So I've been publishing for 40 years. And let's see, I think I've met one Black editor, or maybe two, in Canada in 40 years of being a writer, a published writer. Also, same thing goes for agents, people who run literary festivals, and book critics. I've met one book critic who's Black, who's been a successful and established book critic for years in this country, who's Black. One. And her name is Donna Bailey. She's a terrific writer, a Black woman, and she is the only one I've met who's written, regularly as a book critic in Canada. And so also people who run literary prizes, people who decide who's going to win literary prizes are predominantly and historically have been white. And so the system is stacked in many respects against people of color. And it's changing, and it's vital that it be changing. And I'm proud to be part of that change. But we have a long way to go. So I don't want to sing the blues about myself, because I'd rather answer the question by speaking more broadly. There are profound systemic inequities against Indigenous and Black writers still to this day, even though some of us have been very fortunate and have had tremendously fortunate careers and much success. Many others do not. And it's hard to break through those doors. Believe me, I could have wallpapered my bathroom with rejection slips when I was trying to publish my first book. Nobody wanted it. It's really hard to crash through those gates. And so we have structural inequities that are seen throughout society in other respects too, but also in the world of literature. So there are many systemic inequities that make it hard for Black and Indigenous and writers of color to survive and thrive in this country. It's getting better, but we have a long way to go.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Our next question is from Kina. Do you think the literary awards just around this question here, who we're talking about. Awards groups such as the Man, Booker, Pulitzer Prizes for Literature are beginning to represent diversity in authors and literary writing. I personally have been exposed to books such as Black Book by Mateo that I would not have heard of before, but I wonder, are they diverse enough?
Yes, is the question, I think, is, are literary prizes becoming more diverse in terms of recognizing, writers of color or Black or Indigenous writers? Absolutely. Absolutely. Is it perfect? No. Is it getting there? Yes. These days, you'd be ashamed if you created a jury to decide, say, the winner of the Giller Prize or another major literary prize in Canada, if you did not have a representation from racial minorities, on that jury. You'd be ashamed and you'd be publicly called out. This was not the case 10 or 20 years ago, where routinely there were all white juries. But these days, it'd be shameful to construct a jury without racial representation on that same jury. So it's getting better. And of course, some of our most lauded writers, Dion Brand, Kinesia Lubrin, Essia Dujan, Austin Clark, David Cheriandy, myself, we've been very fortunate to have been receiving awards. And unfortunately, without awards, it's very hard to get your name in front of the public. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to get your name circulating internationally. If you're a Black Canadian writer and you hope to have any international market penetration, then you better win an award. It's going to be really hard to interest American or Norwegian or Dutch, or German publishers. And so there was sort of an unfortunate necessity, but many Black writers have been recipients of those awards. And so it's getting better. It is getting better, but we have a long way to go.
Okay, so we have one more question, I think. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to just pop them in the Q&A or the chat. But someone would like to know, do you ever provide political undertones in your writing, similar to Mandela? I'm assuming they're referring to Nelson Mandela.
Do I include political overtones in my writing? Well, yes, I'm a writer who believes that all writing is political in a certain respect.
Everything is political.
Everything is political. Beatrice in the Forest with Croc Harry is political with a lowercase p kind of way. Mm-hmm. It's political. It's engaging in political, social issues. So all writing is political, even if it's a novel that's set entirely in somebody's kitchen. The ways in which human beings are relating in that kitchen, the oppression that might be visible in that kitchen has political overtones. So I don't consider myself a political writer in the sense that I write overtly about politics, although I was a political reporter. I was a parliamentary bureau chief for the Winnipeg Free Press, and so I was a reporter when I was a young man in my 20s, and I covered politics and wrote about them and enjoyed writing about them and the Supreme Court of Canada very much. But all writing is political, and my writing is political too.
Thank you so much. I think we're rounding up. This is the last question. Can you please speak to the experience you had with the Dutch gentleman who wanted to burn your book and how you managed to change his point of view?
Sure.
I want to hear you.
Thank you for the question. I'll try to answer quickly because it's a big question. So I got this email about my novel, The Book of Negroes. And thankfully for me, it was published around the world. And bizarrely, outside of the United States, the two countries in which I've been a bestseller outside of North America, a really strong bestseller, are Norway and the Netherlands. Don't ask me why, but it's true. And so I went on tour in the Netherlands with the Book of Negroes, the Dutch translation of the Book of Negroes. And it was a great tour. And I met with many Black communities and gave readings and talks in Black communities in the Netherlands. It was a wonderful, warm and welcoming experience. There are a lot of Black people in the Netherlands. The Dutch were a slave trading nation and they had slave colonies. And so there's a lot of Black history in the Netherlands too, even though most Dutch people don't know it, kind of like Canada. And after coming back from that tour, I got an email from another Black man in the Netherlands who wrote "Dear sir, I intend to burn your book." And that was the first line of his email. He was offended by the title of my book, The Book of Negroes, which resurrects a historical document that the British Navy kept, which was called The Book of Negroes, which documented the movement of Black people from New York City to Nova Scotia during the American Revolutionary War. So I'm resurrecting a forgotten historical document with Black history in it, in using that title. And but he was very offended by the title. And I asked if I could explain the history of the book to him. I tried to explain it. He said, "I don't want to read it. I don't want to hear explanations. I'm burning it because I don't like the title." And it was very upsetting to me because I don't like to be, who likes to be called out or criticized or have their book burned? It's very hard on your career. If there's a scandal associated with your career, publishers might walk away from you, bookstores might stop selling you, people might get cold feet, people might stop inviting you. It has a real chilling effect on your career possibilities when somebody creates a scandal about your book. And it makes people afraid to go near you. And so it's very damaging to most writers when people start burning their books, not to mention it's a hideous thing to do, and it precedes often violence. And my publisher's life was threatened. It was very painful. But I wrote about it. And the book that I wrote about was called Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book, An Anatomy of a Book Burning. It's published by the University of Alberta Press. So if you're interested, it's a short essay. You might find it interesting. Please check it out. Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book, published by the University of Alberta Press. And in that essay, I describe in detail what happened and why this book was burned and what I think about book burning. In a sentence, I'm opposed to book burning.
I should hope so.
Yes, this is a bit of a lighthearted question. I think it'll be a
end on that
one. Yeah, and then we can end on that. So Dr. Natasha Johnson just wants to know if the word "brought-up-see," which I think you used in your book, Beatrice and the Croc Harry, was something you heard growing up, as she heard this often from the Jamaican women in her family.
Isn't "brought-up-see" such a great word? I love that word. It's so rich. So my background is African American, and I did not hear "brought-up-see" when I was a child, but I've been on book tour, in Jamaica and in Martinique, and I've certainly heard from my Jamaican friends and other friends in the Caribbean the term "brought-up-see." So I did not, and it's a Caribbean term more than, say, an African American term. So I did not hear it as a child, but believe me, I've heard it. And so I love the term. It's such a lively, colorful term. You have no brought-up-see. It means like you have no manners. You weren't brought up properly. So it's such a rich and fun word that I just had to use it in the book.
Thank you for that. So those are all our questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer them. So I'll just throw it back to Dr. Patel.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And I will just thank you, Anu and Evelyn, for helping to moderate that question period. I think, there's probably lots that came in, and you did a great job of sort of formulating the questions and putting them together and organizing them in an order that helped the flow of conversation as well. So thank you. I also know that as students, you've got a lot going on right now, both with midterms and with the iRise conference that you're helping to organize. So again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules as well to be here with us this evening. So I will also would like to thank Lawrence for coming tonight and spending a couple of hours with us. I know you've got lots on your plate with the book being released right now, and it was so great to have you and be able to just sort of explore different themes about identity in your books and your writing, and just chat and get to know you a little bit better as well. And I'm sure our audience really appreciated that. And finally, thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your busy evenings, time that you probably would have spent with family, to come and share this space with us, to learn, to unlearn, and to ask your questions, because that's what makes this event what it is. So with that, we will end and say have a great evening. And given it's virtual, hopefully no one has far to go to get home.
Thank you so much. And a special thank you to Evelyn and Anu. I really appreciate your interest and your engagement. Thank you so much, Tejal, for welcoming me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a great time. Thanks. Have a great night, everyone.